Welcome to the SOPA Media Insiders talk today. I'm going to introduce everybody before we get started. First of all, my name is Robin Ewing. I'm a senior lecturer at Hong Kong Baptist University in journalism. I've been in Hong Kong for 17 years, and I've been a judge with the SOPA Awards for more than a decade. And we have three fantastic journalists here with us today for our panel. Before I introduce each of them, I'd just like to give you a few points about the talk today. First of all, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A button that you can type your questions in at any point during today's talk. And when we get to the end of the discussion, I'll address the questions there. So please feel free to ask the panelists anything that you would like. If you're on Twitter, I guess we're supposed to say X now, I'm not sure, and you'd like to use a hashtag, please use the SOPA Awards 2023 or SOPA Talks or SOPA Asia. And we are recording this today, and it will be made available on the SOPA YouTube channel. So you can go back and revisit it, or if you missed it, part of the talk today, please feel free to rewatch it. So let me go ahead and introduce our three journalists today. All of them are 2023 winners of the Women's Issues category, reporting on women's issues for the SOPA Awards. First journalist we have is Alice French. She's working with Nikkei Asia. And she's a reporter, she's deputy editor, and she's a podcaster. And she is calling in from Tokyo today. And her beat is mostly Japanese politics, society, and culture. Prior to working at Nikkei, Alice was a coordinator working for international relations in northern Japan after she graduated from the University of Cambridge in the UK. And her partner, one of her partners for her winning article is Kiran Sharma, who's also with Nikkei. Hi, Kiran. Kiran is the India correspondent, and she is calling in from New Delhi today. And she has more than 2 decades of experience in journalism. She traditionally covers politics, economy, foreign affairs, and social issues. And she and Alice worked together on their winning article. And we also have Siyi with the World of Chinese, an English language magazine dedicated to in-depth reporting on Chinese society. Siyi focuses on human-centered stories about arts, culture, and social issues. And her recent interests include dialect preservation, sex education, and small-time goddesses. I think, Siyi, we need to hear more about the small-time goddesses. So we have 2 fantastic articles. Hopefully you've already read them. If you haven't, I encourage you to look at them on the SOPA Awards website for 2023. And I'm going to let the journalists describe a little bit about their articles so you can have some context if you haven't yet read them. So the first one I'd like Kiran and Alice to discuss is called Abortion in Asia, the Limits of Choice. One honorable mention for excellence in reporting on women's issues. The judges commented that it was a painful topic, but it brings home using personal stories while also powerfully explaining the wider economic and social costs to societies across the region. So Alice and Kiran, it'd be great if you guys could spend about 5 minutes discussing, kind of recapping your article for the audience. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Robin. So yeah, maybe I'll start, and then Kiran, maybe you can jump in too. But yes, so this story is something that we actually did last June, right around the time, it was actually just a couple of weeks before Roe v. Wade was repealed in the States, which we thought was a really good peg, kind of an excuse, not that one needs an excuse, but it was a handy peg to address the issue in Asia too. And we basically just saw a gap in kind of information on English surrounding abortion in Asia. So we took the chance to basically look at 10 different countries across the region and the situation, the kind of legal, social, cultural, religious issues surrounding abortion and reproductive rights. So I reported from Japan, Kiran reported from India, and we also had other Nikkei Asia journalists pitching in from countries from South Korea to Bangladesh to Vietnam to Singapore to China. And we just looked at how abortion affects women's rights, demographics, health issues, religious issues, politics, and all of those kinds of things. And it ended up being actually a really fun project. I mean, a difficult topic to tackle, but we all learned a lot, and it was a great example, I think, of teamwork. We all learned a lot from each other, and it was nice because we had predominantly female journalists, but a couple of male reporters working on it too. And it was a really rewarding project, and I thought we'll get into more of the details later. But Kiran, I don't know if you want to just talk a bit about the India side.
Thank you, Alice, for explaining so well what we have done in this article, and I think it's a team effort. So many reporters were involved all over the Asian region about this very complicated issue. Actually, when you talk about India, maybe when we are describing India, it is the situation across whole South Asia. So it is a subcontinent. It was one country before 1947, and then it divided into India, Pakistan, and further into Bangladesh. So what is basically we are seeing in India is also what you can experience in other countries around India too. So India was one of the first countries actually to legalize abortion way back in 1971 through its Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, which it tweaked in 2020 to give to expand women's access to safe and legal abortion. So I have looked into whether abortion is really safe for all the women, and also the abortion laws are quite liberal in India. Doctors, activists, everybody says so. But what are the negative impact of these laws being liberal? Because there are two aspects. One being unsafe abortion at times, and other being sex selective abortions in India because of this deeply seated cultural preference for male child. So I have looked into this issue deeply. I have spoken to activists. I have spoken to women who have undergone abortions for preference of a male child, basically killing the girl child. So and which is really sad to hear such stories, and also difficult to absorb when you listen to such stories from these people. So basically, I have looked into the South Asian context in this story.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. And Siyi, maybe you can spend a few minutes recapping your story on the road, the consent article. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the article started with a very tragic event that was happening right before at the time when this article was commissioned. So it happened in the city called Tangshan in China's Hebei province, and it happened on the Friday night in a barbecue joint where a man was drunk and then he accosted a woman who said no, and then the guy obviously didn't take the no well, and so he and his buddies decided to beat up a bunch of women. And the barbecue restaurant security camera caught everything on tape, and then it went viral over social media, and everybody was outrageous, and everybody was very outraged, especially women who were having very visceral reactions to this kind of event. And in the wake of this event, there were a lot of discussions about gender-based violence incidents that was happening in China. And right before this, I would say like a month or so before this incident happened, we ran a story about sex education in China. So in the wake of the event, our editorial team kind of had a discussion of, like what is a way to talk about this that is helpful and also a refreshing new lens that will kind of give more insights on the problems that we're facing in the society and tie everything together. And also tragically at the time, I think experience of how fast news cycle and social media moves on from one thing to another. So when I was writing this article, the discussion about this event was mostly about how there is a gang violence problem in the city and shifting away from gender. So we're like trying to bring this lens back on the problem there. So in this article, we kind of touched on different perspectives in terms of how sexual consent is talked about or not talked about in the Chinese society. reality. So I talked to a woman whose personal experiences, so she was reminded of some past traumatic events in the wake of what happened in Tangshan. And then we also included voices of people who find giving or not giving consent in an unwanted situation difficult, women who are trying to address the problem by raising awareness, but also people whose practices on social media, etc., are actually harmful and might be sabotaging the good work other people are doing in building more awareness on consent. So we are trying to reveal some cultural nuances, for example, how the sexually conservative culture leading to the blurred lines of consent in China, and also shine a light on the lack of sex education. And then we're trying to highlight that it's not like Chinese people don't understand consent at all. There is quite a lot of voices on social media that are trying to not just talk about it, but also find a common ground on how we can talk more about it moving forward.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that. Just a reminder to the audience members, please feel free to write your questions or use the hashtag. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we're all here. Excellent. And I'm going to start off by asking each of you guys some questions about your article specifically. Maybe we can talk about the abortion article first, and then we'll move on to the consent article. And then after that, we can step back and talk maybe about the bigger picture of reporting on women's issues in Asia and your experiences with that. All right. So please feel free to jump in and comment with each other. We can definitely make this a conversation rather than just me interviewing you. So let's start with Alice and Kiran. So when I was reading your article and also listening to you recap it now, I'm really struck by how many different attitudes and different laws there are, and how every country in Asia is kind of approaching it very differently. And I'm wondering if maybe you could spend a little time to explain some of the reasons. I know in your article you said it's not a black and white issue. So spend a little time explaining to the audience and to us, how it's different across Asia, and maybe what are some of the reasons.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. So before we sort of started tackling this issue, we were very aware of the fact that Asia is obviously a very broad and very diverse region. And I just want to preface this all by saying that our story is really just only skims the surface. And there are some countries that we unfortunately couldn't include. There's still a lot more to be done, I think, for raising awareness of the issue throughout Asia. But the first thing that kind of struck us when we first started tackling this was that the issue of abortion and reproductive rights really does affect every single aspect of society, from things like education to healthcare to religion to politics, to economy to demographics. And so we really realized that we would have to speak to such a wide range of people in every country. And I think Kiran found this too. It was, not just interviewing women, but also interviewing the doctors, interviewing the women's partners, interviewing teachers, interviewing activists. And we very quickly realized that religion, which perhaps is to be expected, was a big influence on reproductive rights issues, particularly in Asian countries such as Indonesia and Malaysia, where obviously Islam is the dominant religion, South Korea, where you have a big Christian population, Thailand, where you have quite a big Buddhist population. All of these countries were heavily influenced by religious values, which I guess is also kind of the same in the West in terms of the Christian argument. But we found that actually these religious views were having obviously a big impact on the laws too, and a lot of the laws surrounding religion, surrounding abortion, are rooted in religion. So that was one thing. Another thing was demographics. So obviously Asia is, and I'm sure Kiran can talk about this more too, but Asia is home to some of the fastest aging and also some of the fastest growing populations in the world. So it was very interesting seeing the different approaches to abortion as a kind of form of population control. For example, just from my perspective from Japan, which was the country that I focused on, in the post-war period immediately after the war, Japan actually had one of the most liberal approaches to abortion. It actually legalized abortion in 1948, which is one of the earliest countries to do so, as a way to control the population after the war, because soldiers were returning from war and more babies were being created, but there was less food and resources to go around. So it was used as essentially a way to control the population. And now obviously Japan is sort of in the opposite position, where it's really struggling with a declining birth rate and aging population, and is having to come to terms with that, and whether or not abortion could or should play a role in solving that issue. And similarly in China's also recently come up against the same issue. And then the third kind of main issue that we realized was a big factor, again, probably to be expected, is sort of socio-cultural and traditional ideas towards gender. So traditional gender roles in the home, ideas about women being at home and men going to work, and also now feminism becoming a lot of a bigger issue in a lot of these countries, particularly developing countries, and how that's then feeding into discussions around productive rights, or in many ways how reproductive rights end up sort of left out of the feminist conversation in a lot of these countries. And I'm sure Kiran can speak on also the issue, as she mentioned, of sex selective abortions, and how that's sort of a very complex and nuanced aspect of this, and how that feeds into the difference between sort of bodily autonomy for women, but then actually that potentially having the downside of leading to actually a lot of female fetuses being aborted. So yeah, it was definitely very complex and very nuanced, and I think India is a really good example of that. So maybe Kiran, do you want to speak a little bit on what you found?
Yeah, actually, as I said previously, that India legalized abortion in 1971, and basically to control a booming population. That was the need of the hour. And then it further tweaked the abortion law in 2021, and now the definition in the Act includes both married and unmarried women. Earlier, it was only the married women which could seek abortion on the basis of failed contraception. But now if a woman is single, it is being seen very progressive in a country like India, that she can also go and seek abortion on the basis of failed contraception. And now the upper gestation limit for going for abortion has been increased to 24 weeks from 20 weeks earlier, and in special cases. And beyond 24 weeks, a medical board is empowered to allow or deny termination of pregnancy, after examining the state of the woman's health and the fetus's health. So any woman, irrespective of marital status, can ask for medical termination of pregnancy now in view of failure of contraception. So this is one of the very good developments which has happened because of the amendment of the Act. Now, India's abortion laws are being seen as, further liberalized after the 2021 amendment. And in some cases, doctors say that certain anomalies are not detected up to 20 weeks of pregnancy and come to light only in 22, 24 weeks. And thus, if a woman wants an abortion, she can seek an abortion. And if the doctor advises, she can even go for abortion after the 20th week of pregnancy. However, as I said earlier, that, there's another side to it, there are increased number of unsafe abortions, reports of which we keep on reading in media. And the problem basically arises because of the unsupervised use of abortion drugs, which are bought over the counter to terminate unwanted pregnancies. So people buy these medicines without actually knowing the complications that can occur, including heavy bleeding, which may lead to surgical intervention. And in some cases, a woman could even lose her life if not treated timely. So, probably we would not be having many women seeking abortion had there been a greater awareness about contraception, which is not there at present, at that scale in the country. And the other aspect which, I earlier mentioned was about sex selective abortions in India because of the cultural preference for a male child, because a boy is traditionally seen as a future breadwinner and somebody who will take care of the aging parents, while a girl is treated as a financial burden who will be married off and sent to another house with dowry and basically support the marital home. So there was a research published in 2020, I think, by the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, which said that the total female birth deficit in India during the 27 to 2030 period is projected to be 6.8 million, which is like, nearly 7 million fewer girls will be born in the country, estimated to be, less than 7 million born girls. Unborn girls are there. And because of the sex selective abortions during the period between 2017 and 2030. And this is despite the fact that sex selective abortions and prenatal sex determination tests are banned in India. And there are stringent laws. But still, people are going to certain clinics, backstreet clinics, and some shady outlets which are offering these services. And, unfortunately, these things are taking place. Sex selective abortions are happening in the country. And, and the government is aware of it. They are taking measures to stop it, but each and every person is thinking. And then because it is legal to terminate pregnancy up to 20th week, and there are several grounds, which they can show.
Okay, Kiran, I think Kiran's frozen for me. Can you guys hear her, or is that just?
Yeah, she froze for me too.
Okay, I thought maybe it was just my internet. All right. Well, let me continue the discussion that she was, the topic she was discussing right there is some of the impacts of abortion laws. I know is like, as you said, Alice, this is so much bigger than just reproductive rights. And Kiran was discussing, sex selective abortions and how I think she said 7 million unborn girl children. That's huge. So what are some of the impacts that we're seeing from some of the more restrictive laws, or maybe even in places where, like India, where they're quite open and free, right? What is the impact of 7 million children not being born, or 7 million girls not being born, or the kind of the safety? And to continue with that, I know in the US, there's been research that shows that restrictive abortion laws pushes women out of higher paying jobs and into lower paying jobs. And are we seeing any of that in Asia as well?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully when Kiran comes back on, maybe she's back. Good. Oh, you're back.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's okay. The internet always comes out when we're doing something important, doesn't it? I was just saying, I'd love to hear more from both of you kind of on these impacts. I know you were talking about sex selective abortions, 7 million girls not being born, unsafe abortions. And then I was also asking about economic impacts. Is it pushing women out of higher paying jobs and into lower paying jobs, or any other impacts that we're seeing from abortion laws in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I think first of all, just to say that there's definitely a huge lack of data about this. So, we, from our reporting and from anecdotal evidence, we've definitely seen that it does have a huge impact on things like you mentioned, female employment rate, women getting promotions or not. I mean, at the end of the day, reproductive rights and women having the power to decide what happens to their own body and at what time is really behind a woman's life and career choices, So the ability to decide when or whether one has a child does really have huge impacts on your career, both at the time and in the future. And I think particularly in developing nations in Asia, so India, Indonesia, Thailand, that are really, at the moment putting focus on economic development, and particularly things like startups and getting more women and young people into business and things like that. Reproductive rights and sort of gender issues in general are coming to the fore and slowly starting to be discussed as something that's actually really important from an economic perspective, not just from a it would be nice to have more rights for women. It's actually a practical thing that needs to be addressed. I mean, just looking at Japan, for example, which obviously is the third biggest economy in the world, although it's been stagnating for quite a number of years now. There's for many decades, there's been evidence that shows that as soon as a woman has a child, she pretty much drops out of the workforce for a good chunk of her life. She then enters back again, but she enters at the same sort of position, or maybe even lower than before she had the child. It's very difficult to come back in at the same pay and sort of seniority that you left at. And of course, that has a huge impact on your future career prospects, your future salary, and things like that. Also, issues which we also saw in the reporting from China too, in particular, issues about attitudes towards single mothers, for example. It's very difficult in a lot of countries in the region to be a single mother, both in terms of the amount of support you get from the state, and also just the sort of social and cultural attitudes to single mothers. And that really has a big impact on a lot of women's decisions about whether or not to have children. And obviously, if you don't have the choice to potentially not have a child that, you know, what was an accident or whatever, that has a big impact on your choices. And the only option for you might be to just drop out of the workforce. And this actually links into something which Nikkei Asia has also been reporting on, which is women's wealth. So we've seen, and actually another Nikkei Asia story, which I highly recommend everyone to look at, is we recently did a series on this, on women's wealth, and it actually won in the global category of the SOPAs. And that shows that women's wealth in Asia, well, Asia is the fastest growing region in terms of women's share of wealth between now and 2026. So even faster than North America, and also women will hold the second biggest amount of wealth in the world after North America, which is a pretty significant development. And obviously, if we're looking towards, you know, more women being in business, women being in high-paid jobs, more women owning their own businesses, things like reproductive rights, as Kiran mentioned, contraception, also what Siyi is going to talk about later, sex education and things like that. Also further down the line, childcare, menopause, all of these sorts of things become a lot more relevant the more we see women going into business, and the more we see women going into sort of higher paid, higher status jobs. So yes, the short answer is yes, it definitely has a huge impact on economics and also on health. Something we haven't really mentioned so far, I mean, Kiran touched on the fact that a lot of women in India end up getting sort of backstreet or unsafe abortions if they want to get rid of a female child. And that's something that's even more of an issue in countries like, for example, the Philippines, Indonesia, where anti-abortion laws are some of the strictest in the world. And often the only option is to go to, you know, a backstreet clinic. And the graph that we showed at the beginning of the webinar shows that just, you know, preventing abortion legally doesn't actually stop it from happening. And it just means that women are pushed further to go and get potentially unsafe abortions. And then because it's so illegal to have an abortion, if they do have health complications after that, they don't go to the hospital, they don't go and get medical care, and that can be fatal for a lot of women. We found in the reporting that around 3 women a day in the Philippines are dying from unsafe abortions, which is pretty insane if you think about how that's going to add up over time. And so yeah, it affects women's health, it affects their income. I think it really underpins a lot of societal and economic issues, and it really needs to be talked about more from lots of different angles. And Kiran, I don't know if you can talk a bit more about the impact of the sex selective abortions, the kind of wider impact of that on society.
Yes, so you know, the child sex ratio at birth is quite skewed in India, you know, because I think if you see for every 1,000 boys, around 929 girls are born. Okay, so that is not a good number. So because of why it is happening, because of the sex selective abortions, and the government, as I'm saying, that it is trying its best to stop this practice. Nevertheless, you know, the preference for male child is forcing people, and even women themselves. I've spoken to a number of women, you know, if I asked them if they just had only one child, what would they prefer to have, and they all said, boy. I was shocked to hear it, because, you know, if they just have to have just one child, they'll go for a boy, because this is what, where the societal respect comes, you know. They think that if they are able to bear a male child, they have more respect in the society, especially in the rural side of the country. In urban areas also, you know, because see, they have to work and they don't want more children. And again, if they want only one child, they'll go for a boy because they think that it is easier to raise a boy, because there are so many things, with the girls, there are so many things attached. You have to keep them secure, because especially, in India, you read reports where stepping out in the night for girls is not easy all by themselves. So there are so many factors. Even these women who are raised in, with certain conditionalities growing up, they see that their brothers are allowed the freedom to walk out any time of the day. They are allowed to go to tours. They're allowed to do whatever they want, but the girls are confined to home. So having grown up in an environment like this, they would also prefer later in their marital life to have a boy, because they think that for boys, it all comes easy. So I'm not saying everybody is like that, but those who are broad-minded, those who prefer a girl child over a boy, their number is minuscule. So of course, because of the selective abortion, we have fewer number of girls. Although there was a national family survey which was conducted between 2019 and 21, which says that the overall sex ratio of male-female in India, it is like 120 women over 1,020 women over 1,000 males. So which is a great number. But then, there is one factor that women tend to outlive men. This is one of the reasons, probably. But again, that, national family surveys are not the national census. So national family surveys are the sample surveys. So if India has 300 million households, so they take a sample of like 500,000 households. And based on that, these figures come out that, okay, we have more women than men in India. But unless we have the every household counted, which can only happen in the national census, which happens every 10 years and which is due by over 2 years now, then the clear picture would emerge. So and as you talked about the economic impact of having a child or having abortion. So fortunately, in India, the family bonding is so strong that if you have a child and you want to go back to work, there is support from everywhere. When most of the families I have seen, there are elderly, there are parents who are willing to take care of your child, and you are able to go back to work. And then the availability of helps, like domestic help, the labor is cheap. And then women who can't afford to have their parents around or in-laws around to raise their children, they have the help to take care of their kids, so they can go back to work. So I won't see that much economic impact when I see the urban setting around me. But yeah, as I already told you about the sex selective abortion's impact on the society, is that we have lesser number of girls, and it is very unfortunate.
I mean, we saw this in China as well. Go ahead, Alice, please. Yeah.
No, sorry. I was just going to say, Kiran, I feel like India, one of the quotes that has stuck in my mind the most from doing that story was from a woman that you interviewed, who said that from a just kind of feminist movement perspective, it makes it very complicated in India, because one would generally assume that, a women's rights activist would want more liberal abortion rights. But in India, essentially fighting for more liberal abortion rights means potentially making it easier to abort more female fetuses, right? So
yes,
it makes it really complicated from a kind of social, from a rights perspective too, right?
I mean, I was struck by that as well. Yeah.
That quote is quite telling, because I interviewed. Yeah, and I've interviewed the campaigners, and who were saying that we don't want more liberal abortion rights in India because they can be easily misused. And we don't want those rights to be misused for female feticide to be done here, because it is already rampant. We don't want for more girls being killed in this country. So they don't want to ask for more liberal abortion rights. They say that our rights are quite liberal, and what we have is already good. We don't want anything more than that. And not only because as the sex determination of a preborn child who is not born is banned, and also sex selective abortion is banned, doctors can face jail and even revocation of their license. Nevertheless, it is happening clandestinely in the country. And if some people who somehow are not able to find the gender of the child, they are carrying, then if they are affluent, they go abroad and they find out the sex of the child and come back and go to some illegal clinic to get the abortion done. So there are many ways through which this thing is being practiced in India, and this is despite the government's best effort to stop it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and as I was saying, the sex selective abortions we're seeing, we've seen that. You said Vietnam, I think in your article, was a big place where it's not just India that it's happening. And we all know about, China and the one-child policy and kind of the impact of that, which I think is a good transition. Siyi, I'd really like to hear some of your thoughts on your article. And, what are some of the big issues around, women's issues in China? Like what's being talked about and what are the big stories right now? Yeah.
I was having some shakes.
Oh, we're having more
Yeah,
internet
question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes. Oh, wait, we froze again.
Yeah, and oh no. Okay. How about now?
I think it's okay. Go ahead.
I think maybe there's a little bit of a lag, but I think I'll go ahead and if you interrupt me, I'll know that the connection is not going well. So yeah, to touch on a little bit about, since we're on the topic of abortion and reproductive rights, as you all probably have heard about like the changes in terms of how many kids a woman can have in the policy. It has been changing in the past few years. So I think on that front, the problem in China has become more nuanced. I think the women's rights to have a choice over reproduction and marriage, there is still a problem in that regard. It's just not as obvious. Like you might it's easy to think like, oh, in the past you can only have one kid and there's the possibility of forced abortion if that regulation is broken. And now it seems like it's fine. But I would say a lot of the aspects that's causing this issue over rights of choice to continue is kind of more in the cultural background, because I think in a lot of people's mind there is still the gender imbalance in terms of like who gets to have more say in family matters, and what are the voices that a woman needs to consider when she decides to have or to not have babies. So there's that still. And women's issues more in general, I think it's very complicated to give a succinct answer if we were to try to touch on all the issues here. I think there's for example, in the issues that we've reported on in the past year or so, I think there's a lot of online defamation instance that we're seeing. So it's very easy with social media these days to make rumors, especially sexual rumors about women. And I would also say there is still discrimination in hiring in terms of companies, employers being concerned that women's family planning would affect her career, much like how what Kiran touched on before about, sorry, it was Alice, I think, about women in Japan. If you have a child, you leave work, and then to go back into the work, you kind of go back to a same level or even lower level. I think similar things we are also seeing that in China. I would say another issue, which is not directly a women's issue or women's rights issue, but more kind of a issue in terms of how we talk about women's rights, is that I think there is a fair amount of feminism movement in China at the moment, and a lot of women, especially in urban areas, who are young, well-educated, tech-savvy, who are good at using social media to raise a voice. We're hearing a lot of that. So I think there's also the risk of mistaking what the amount of voice there, and to kind of use that as a benchmark or the concern of all women all across China, because I feel like China, whether geographically, culturally, socio-economic background-wise, is very, very diverse. So the voices that are that are the loudest out there, I think it's super valuable, but it still doesn't cover the entire landscape of what women are dealing with inside China.
Absolutely. Right. And so your article specifically focused on kind of the confusion around sexual consent. And I was going to ask you, how, and I know that's connected to many topics, right? It can be connected to violence against women. It's connected against trafficking of girls and women, right? But how difficult is or sensitive is it to report on these issues? Are people talking about this on social media? And if for you as a journalist to go out and to find sources for these stories, is that challenging?
I think let me see how to kind of best structure that answer. So yes, it is sensitive, but in many different ways. So I think what might be surprising to a lot of people is that on these articles we've done about sex education or sexual consent, the biggest challenge in terms of sensitivity that we have faced is not from the hardline censorship. Like, we didn't have any problem reporting these stories from within our team or from the higher ups. But I think the kind of just the environment of how these topics are being discussed and how there is not a consensus means that there will be people who react badly to it. So we have in the past, within the world of Chinese, we have had a article on LGBTQ clubs in colleges and an article on China's most famous Me Too court case being taken down, not because of censorship, but because of someone reported the articles on the social platform that we were publishing. So it's I think it's the societal reaction or the lack of consensus and the more conservative view on sex in general is what's causing this to become very sensitive. So I think in one of my articles, I think the one about sex education, I mentioned that there were some really good sex education textbooks being published in China, but they were taken down from all sales channels because some parents reported. And in those textbooks, there are actually really good material on sexual consent. There was a chapter with this image that kind of shows a scenario where an adult woman is asking a little boy to see his penis, and then so it's trying to teach kids of like what is an appropriate thing to say in these contexts. But there are some parents who decided that this is like spoiling our kid and making them less innocent, so they decided to work against this kind of materials being out there. So yeah, as you can see, like sex is not very openly talked about, except for maybe I think it's changing among young people. So other than that, there's also a lot of misogyny online still. I think I follow a few misogynistic social media accounts just to see like what we're facing out there. And for every issue, every one of these main incidents that happen regarding to women's issue, they always had something to say that's kind of very much against the feminist voice. So I think regarding sensitivity, another aspect would be that because of this environment, a lot of the women who we want to talk to for some of our women's issue stories feel very reluctant to really share their experience because so recently, actually, a very good example is my colleague Ting Ting worked on an article about women working to promote feminism in small towns in China outside of the metropolises like Shanghai and Beijing. And then she found it was very difficult to find someone who's willing to talk. And then when she finally found someone, her interviewee was very skeptical in the beginning. She kept on asking, like, are you trying to use my words to write an article that's against feminism? I think like it just goes to show how much someone working on feminism in China probably has gone through for her to have this immediate reaction to someone who hasn't really revealed any of that inclination. So yeah, I think a lot of the sensitivity is coming from there.
Okay. And another thing that struck me in your article is you talked about you said like, people aren't talking about sex and sex education as much, but there's this influence from pop culture, right? So you were talking about TV shows and movies and how they depict consent and romance. And I know we're seeing a pushback against that in the West a little bit. I mean, I think my news peg was the Barbie movie and how Ken was portrayed. I don't know if anybody's seen that, but it was quite humorously done. But I'm wondering if we're seeing that in China. Is there any kind of pushback or any women involved in kind of creating a different kind of pop culture?
I would think the answer to that is a definite yes. So to my knowledge, I haven't seen anything as like in your face as Barbie coming out of China recently. But there's a lot of I would say, like, especially women filmmakers, artists that are trying very hard to make their perspectives heard through their work. We're seeing a lot of women artists, filmmakers who are trying to create more nuanced female characters in film and TV, which is still kind of, you know, like problematic very often. And then I think another thing that's another aspect of the pushback is very much on the grassroots, and we're seeing it on social media a lot. So back to the topic of sex education, we are significantly lacking that in our formal education system. But if you go on, for example, Bilibili, which is one of China's most popular video sharing platform, there are a bunch of sex education influencers that are making their own content to varying degrees of quality, but they're very creative. There is one woman who dresses up as a doctor sometimes, and she uses very imaginative props. And then there's a scholar who is a professor at a university in Beijing, who is, I think, one of China's most authoritative researcher on the topic. And then she also answers parents' questions on those platforms. So yeah, I would say a lot of people are trying to kind of, you know, find a way that is kind of around the establishment to make their voices heard.
I mean, it sounds like social media plays a really big role in awareness and in movement towards change. Do you agree? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I definitely think so. I think social media actually brings up a lot of opportunities for people to, I mean, still within limitations, but to relatively freely express their concerns or their opinions, or to kind of find a way to implement change. So for example, in the sexual consent article, I think I did mention a influencer who put up an exhibition, and then she made a video of how kind of the viewers of the exhibition talks about sexual consent, how women discuss the challenges in like withholding sexual consent, or even dealing with the fail of not giving consent, the failure towards not giving consent. And then she posted that on social media to reach a wider audience. So I think there's a very, very invigorating, very dynamic discussion about gender about issues related to sexuality and sex education going on social media. And it's a way to patch up what the formal education media is lacking. And it's also an organic reflection of like what people are feeling and what they need. So I think people are more informed nowadays. For example, if this were like 5 to 10 years ago, no one was speaking up about the sexual harassment cases. I mean, no one is a exaggeration, but very few voices are heard, like not to the degree that everybody knows about. But nowadays, every time, still, I think in the recent months, there were a good amount of sexual harassment cases that got exposed. And every time that happened, there were a lot of very young women, actually, I would say like young and old women who are willing to actually stand up and then talk about these very vulnerable experiences. And I really think social media has a role to play in that. But I also think social media also creates an opportunity for sabotaging the works that other people are doing, because I guess it's there are different, as I said before, the issues about sexual consent, there's no consensus about consent. So if someone is trying to spread awareness in one way, there might be other people doing content that's contrary to yeah. So often also I think social media, as we all know, works as an echo chamber. So it's also easy to take, for example, I think my friends circle are very aware of women's issue, and it's very easy to take that as a sign of health in the society in general, but very often that is not the case.
Right, absolutely.
Oh, and I might also add that not just for gender-related issues, I would say in social media, we're also seeing a lot of other issues being addressed. So for example, last year I also wrote an article about the protection of of dialect, and we're seeing a lot of dialect content being created and spread on social media, and that was something that I would say like the dialect revival is something that the government is catching onto and is trying to address in some cities, but it's not really working very well. But on social media instead, you're seeing a much more vibrant series of actions in that movement.
Yeah, right. And I also, going back to the lead of your article, the opening story, and what you discussed in the beginning, where it showed, the brawl between, the men that attack the women who said no, right? And that's not about awareness, but it's creating that link between consent and violence that maybe people don't see that link, right? So I think social media can be very important. So it's interesting to hear your thoughts. So I thought we're getting some really good questions from the Q&A. So I thought I'd turn to the audience. Maybe I'll start at the beginning. Charlotte had a very nice question. She wanted to know, she said she'd be very interested to hear about the main barriers which the panel face from their organizations and employers when it comes to reporting on women's issues. So I'm not sure if that's a topic that you'd all like to touch. Because obviously the barriers aren't just coming from finding sources, but they're from we have a lot of research that shows that women's issues are underreported around the world, right? So if you could speak to that question, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so I kind of touched on this at the beginning. I think not so much specifically kind of from an organizational point of view, but I think in general, and this is something that we have discussed amongst ourselves before, there's kind of an assumption that like women's issues or gender issues should be reported by female journalists, which brings with it advantages and disadvantages, right? Because particularly when you're talking about sensitive issues like reproductive rights or consent or assault and things like that, often female sources will be more comfortable speaking to a female journalist. But at the same time, it does, I mean, Siyi, also you just mentioned it can feel a bit like an echo chamber. It can kind of feel a bit like it's just women. I mean, women's issues is also kind of a complicated term in that obviously gender issues affect all genders, men, LGBTQ, the whole spectrum. And like I say, it was really nice that we had some of our fellow male journalists from Nikkei Asia working on the story with us, because I definitely feel like there is space for more men to be pursuing these kind of stories and kind of raising awareness of these issues, and also bigging up and promoting stories by female colleagues or whatever, whether it's from within their organization or elsewhere. Because unfortunately, I mean, particularly in the region, I mean, Japan, just for example, in a lot of decision-making roles and political roles and where the decisions actually get made, still the majority of the voices are male. And if they are not advocating for the women who are speaking out, it kind of just ends up being a bit of an echo chamber, and it doesn't actually lead to change. So I would say, I don't know, that was my kind of personal feeling with this story, was that yes, it was brilliant that we could be women and talking about issues that directly affect us, but also kind of the support from male colleagues is also really, really important, and something that I think needs to be continued.
Absolutely. Kiran or Siyi, did you have
Yeah,
anything to add?
if I may add a few lines to this, actually, you know, in the fraternity here in India, among the journalists, I have seen the male colleagues of mine. They are quite interested, you know, in writing about women's issues. But you know, the topics like sex, abortion, menstruation, you know, there is such a taboo attached to them that women themselves are not willing to speak to them. So what happens is, even if they want to take up this topic, they are not really able to get information from the direct source. So they may go to the authorities, policy makers, they may talk to the analysts, they may talk to activists and even feminists. But those who are actually impacted, you know, those women in the rural areas or those probably in the urban areas too, they are not very comfortable speaking about these topics with a journalist who is male. So I think though there is an inclination to write about such issues, these are the hindrances which they face, which I have heard from my colleagues. So I think being a woman, it becomes easier to access such information from the fellow women when you are reporting on such topics. I'm not talking about in general in other countries, but this is what I have seen here. So if you are a woman, you can easily, I won't say exactly very easily, but yeah, you have to like really be empathetic to their issues, and you have to really putting in your best efforts to listen to them, and then they come up with their stories to you. And it's not a one-day job. Like, you know, if you're writing a good story, it takes weeks, you know, to get really good sources. So yeah, this is what I wanted to add to what Alice said.
All right. So yeah, I don't know if you're there. Okay, I think maybe some more internet issues. Well, Rita also going on that same topic. Rita is an Indonesian journalist and member of the SOPA editorial committee, and she wanted to know, to Alice and Kiran, did you spend any time exploring abortion issues in conservative Muslim countries like Indonesia or Malaysia? And then she said where abortion is illegal and both married and unmarried women cannot access safe abortions. And she was asking about those countries.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We did actually, and the story actually begins in Indonesia. So our colleague Ismi, who is based in Jakarta, she did some amazing on the ground reporting, speaking to women, all of whom spoke to her anonymously, who had actually gone through illegal, unsafe abortions and hearing about their experiences. And she had a really interesting and quite disturbing anecdote, which is that so abortion is illegal, but forcing, like the act of forcing someone to abort their child is actually not. So this is in Indonesia. So Ismi had this one case of a woman who basically was in an unmarried relationship with this guy who was a police officer, I believe. So he was quite a sort of socially high-ranking individual. And they got pregnant out of wedlock, and she wanted to keep the baby, but they weren't married, and it was really going to affect his career. So he actually forced her to abort the baby by secretly like slipping an abortion pill into her drink or something. And this actually ended up happening twice because she got pregnant again, and she was so just traumatized by the whole thing that she actually ended up taking her own life. It's a really shocking and tragic story, and Ishmi was saying that there are actually a lot of cases like that, and that case in particular got a lot of media attention, but the guy himself wasn't actually punished, because it would be the woman who, I guess, underwent the abortion that actually would have been punished. Obviously she unfortunately passed away, but that for me at least really highlighted the kind of underlying sexism that is to do with this, because quite often the abortion itself, and I guess this also links into the sex selective things. I think, Kiran, you were also saying in your reporting that in a lot of cases women are actually forced either by their partners or their families to abort children, whether it's because they're a girl or whether it's because, you know, the family can't support it. And so yeah, we did find the reporting on Indonesia. We didn't have the chance to look at Malaysia, but I would imagine it's kind of similarly strict and difficult there. And like I mentioned earlier, a lot of women end up having abortions, but they're just unsafe and illegal, which actually leads to a lot more problems than potentially just liberalizing the laws would be. so yeah, the Indonesia angle was really interesting, and I think what Ishmi said was that it's actually becoming more and more of a discussed topic because of this case of this woman taking her own life, and it's actually seeping more and more into kind of gender-related discourse. So we may see over the next few years some kind of development in terms of perhaps loosening abortion laws, but at the moment the sort of Islamic views are still really dominant. So no imminent changes, I think.
Yeah.
So I just want to add something to this, because India houses a large Muslim community too. So it has the world's third largest Muslim community living here. So culturally, we are very similar, whether we are Hindus, Muslims, and religiously may be different. So though when I'm earlier talking about the male preference in this country, that includes Muslims also. So whatever applies to the majority Hindu, that also applies to Muslims in this country when it comes to sex selective methods. In some cases, maybe because of the religious belief, the people are not going for abortion in some cases, but then they are producing more children. But again, this is happening in across the communities. So it is not just one particular community which is facing this. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question. Oh, Siyi, did you have something to add? Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, I just came back because I had
I know,
a long
we're so glad you're
internet
back.
break. Yeah, I might have missed out on the questions that's just
okay.
being discussed. But I think when the last time I was still online, you were discussing probably the role of reporting on women's issue as a woman.
Right. Oh,
Right?
absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I did want, if I can, I still want to add a little bit on that. So I think Alice and Kiran both touched on the aspect of building rapport and then to create this understanding. And I also want to say that I was able to do the sexual consent story partly thanks to our women leadership at our editorial team. So it was our managing editor at the time, Hattie, who brought up the angle of sexual consent. And so on our team, there are 8 people on our editorial team, and 6 of them are women. And within our whole magazine, among the 5 directors, there are 4 women. So I think that definitely created a environment where we feel safe and also supported and inspired to report on more on the women's stories. And I also wanted to touch a little bit of the challenges of reporting on women's issues as a woman. One, of course, you put too much of yourself into it, and it really, I remember I spent a whole week listening to topics about sexual consent podcasts and scrolling on the internet nonstop, and then also talking to people about their experiences. And it's really easy to empathize and then to really feel sad or angered about the issues that are still going on. And I think another challenge is that I think it's tempting to stand in, put yourself into the situation as a woman and thinking that because I am the woman, I have this or that authority on this issue, which can be very, very misleading, because as we all said, it's the views on women's issue and the challenges are very, very diverse. So I think it's dangerous that because I'm a woman, I know about women's issue, therefore I can speak for other people. So yeah, I just wanted to jump in and share that.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a really good transition to a next question we got from one of our audience members, Jay. Hi, Jay. He's asked an excellent question. He wants to know if the way in which women's issues have been covered, has it changed or has it kind of stayed the same since you first started in your careers, reporting careers?
I mean, Kiran, I'd love to hear from you. I think you've been with Nikkei a lot longer than I have, so maybe you can speak on that.
Yeah, actually, there is a lot more awareness about women's issues nowadays. And a few years, just about a decade ago, as he mentioned, that there was less reporting of sexual harassment cases, and which is happening right now, maybe thanks to social media and other awareness generation platforms, because of which greater number of women are coming forward to report such cases. So definitely, if I just look into the cases rape or any kind of sexual harassment, the number of those cases being reported has definitely increased. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the incidents have increased per se, but I think the reporting has increased, and people are also taking note of it by writing about them, and other issues relating to women, because there is a child and women development ministry in India. There are a lot of schemes which are being launched, and in greater numbers than before. And then a lot of topics, which were taboo earlier, be it women's health, menstruation, and in fact, one of the very interesting topics which is being talked about is like how there is a lack of availability of sanitary pads in rural areas of India. Like more than 50% women don't have access to these pads, and how the hygiene, menstrual hygiene, how important it is. So there's a lot of focus on that, which these topics were not being talked about earlier, and I see a lot more reporting about them. And then there is an issue of surrogacy. People are writing about surrogacy in a big number, because India moved to ban the commercial surrogacy, and there were reports in favor of it and against it. And in fact, I also participated in a big story on that a few years ago. And then there's so many other things happening. For example, because some estimates say that India has now become the world's largest country by population. So obviously, there nearly half of them are women. So there are so many issues, which are being projected. And one of another big story which I worked on. Big story is like our cover story, weekly story, which is called Big Story, and that was about how in villages, across villages, and even poor urban areas, toilets are being built with government assistance. So this is one of the issues which was not being talked about earlier. People are talking about toilets for women, for their hygiene, for their reproductive health. So I have seen that the awareness about these issues, it has increased over the years, and right now there's a lot more reporting than before.
Alice or Siyi,
Yeah, I mean, so I've only actually been reporting in Japan for about 2 years. But even in the space of that time, I feel like there has been, I mean, as Kiran said, like there's definitely a big increase in just awareness of gender issues. And like I mentioned before, the fact that it actually is linked to economic and sort of financial and business issues, and it's not just kind of women complaining about women's stuff. And also particularly this year, just from a Japan perspective, so Japan hosted the G7 summit, obviously for the first time in 7 years. And I feel like that really created a huge buzz and kind of boom in talking not just about gender, but general social issues in Japan. And obviously Japan inevitably gets compared to the other 6 members of the G7, and a lot of gender related parameters, it does rank quite poorly. And so that really created a lot of buzz around talking about things like reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, women in business, maternity leave, paternity leave, all of those kinds of things. So I mean, I can only speak for Japan, but I feel like external pressure has a lot of impact on the way that the issues are reported domestically too. And sort of the idea that one doesn't want to be kind of getting left behind. So yeah, that's been really interesting to see, because it's really kind of come alive almost before my eyes in the space of about sort of 8 months or so. That's not to say there wasn't any reporting on it at all before, but it's just definitely really been amplified over the last year or so. And I think the G7 had a big impact on that.
Yeah. Siyi, anything to add to that, to changes in women's reporting on women's issues?
I would say I might have very little to add, because my reporting career has only been about 2 years. But I think during my reporting time, definitely my personal understanding of women's issue within China has increased a lot, especially since before 2020, I was living in the United States. So the information about what's going on within within feminism in China is often from Western media, and I think it's that Western media kind of towards a bit on some issues that domestic media don't get to report on, but often there's also this predominant focus on policy and government attitudes. Whereas I feel like since I started reporting in China, I got to learn more about the various personal stories and the individual perspectives and the varying degrees of them on the ground here. So I think it kind of made me realize that there is a lot more action being done on the ground and more grassroots movement than I had previously expected.
Interesting. Well, we have a couple more questions, two more actually from the audience, and then we'll try and wrap it up so we don't take too long. Jennifer says, thank you for your time. And she asked a question that I was very interested in as well. She says, have you found in your news gathering that there's enough information out there in terms of like statistics and surveys to give a fair picture of women's lives in Asia? Or do you think there are gaps in data collection, maybe gender-based?
Yeah, I mean, short answer is yes, there are definitely gaps. So anyone, and I know, Robin, you also mentioned this when we spoke before, if you read the abortion story, you'll see that we use almost exclusively data from an American organization called the Guttmacher Institute on abortion statistics. And even those stats, as useful as they are even at their newest from 2019. So yes, I think particularly with regards to things like abortions and reproductive rights, as Kiran might also want to add, there are official statistics, released by the government, but obviously they don't cover things like the unsafe and illegal abortions. Also, just to give an example from more recent reporting, I've recently been looking into gender in startup sphere and the percentage of startups, for example, that are founded by or co-founded by women, and that's another area, at least in Japan, that is very under researched, and there's very little data. There are a few very small kind of think tanks doing little snippets of surveys and things, but it's very difficult to find gender specific data on a lot of stuff, and the things that are out there are quite outdated or use very small samples. Also, obviously now we have a much broader view of gender. It's not just looking at women and men. Once you start introducing things like non-binary and LGBTQ populations as well, it obviously becomes a lot more complicated. And I feel like media in general and sort of data gathering organizations in general are only just starting to come to terms with what that means in terms of how data is collected and analyzed. So yeah, there's definitely gaps, but there are also some exciting journalists and sort of data gatherers out there that are starting to fill in those gaps, I think. So it's quite an interesting time to be reporting on gender, but definitely still a long way to go, I think.
How about in India or in China, access to data?
Yeah, so I would say that data is available, but we don't have very latest data to rely on. And for some of the people who keep track of all these things when it comes to abortion, gender-related data and all that, so they have told me that because of the COVID pandemic, there has been a setback to the monitoring system as well. So data updation and all that, which we have right now, whatever data is available dates back to 2019. So we still have to redo what we have been doing earlier to collect all that data and again present a clear and today's picture. So that has yet to happen. Having said that, not every data is available. Like we really have to make effort to collect get the data from everywhere. So even if it is global agencies like United Nations Population Program, or there are other agencies which we have quoted in our story. So if there is a good set of data, we have relied on that too. So, but yes, of course, there are gaps and which need to be filled. Thank you.
How about in Chinese? Is it hard to get?
I would say a lot of the issues that Kiran and Alice just mentioned sound very familiar. And I think in terms of direct data, for example, on sexual harassment, if the social taboo is not broken, there will never be accurate direct data on that. If one doesn't want to report a sexual harassment case, then you cannot collect that point of data. For example, if we look at numbers of reported sexual harassment case, I don't know that on top of my head, but suppose when there is an increase or a decrease, it's very hard to say if it's a shift in social attitude which caused people to report more or less, or is that an indicator of whether there are actually more or less cases happening. So I think sometimes we also resort to using indirect data. I'm not sure if this is a piece of data that I included in this article, but I think there was a survey, while there isn't survey on sexual harassment, while there isn't exactly accurate data on sexual harassment, there was a survey about masculinity probably almost a decade ago. So maybe I did not include that piece in the article, but it kind of surveys on men's attitude towards what you're entitled to do toward a woman. So I think sometimes with a lack of data, we'll have to be smart and then kind of go around to see what are some other things that can reflect as an aspect of the story.
Okay, good. And the last question came from Dominique, and I think this was probably written when Siyi, we were talking about social media. But she's asking, where can she find these conversations on social media? Do you have any suggestions on specific accounts or maybe some places that audience members could go to see more about, what's being talked about online? I think we actually just lost Siyi again. But how about Alice and Kiran? Are you finding that social media is helpful for finding out, what's being talked about on the ground? Is there anything that you might recommend for Dominique?
Yeah, for sure. Things are probably quite different between India and Japan, but at least in Japan, I personally find Instagram to actually be the most useful place. I feel like at the moment there's a lot of activism happening on Instagram. There are a lot of, for example, university student-led accounts. There's an organization that I find quite helpful called Girl Up, which is a UN it's a worldwide kind of UN movement that basically brings together women and girls to talk about gender issues, and they have branches in most countries and a lot of Asian countries, and they're particularly active on Instagram. So that's a good suggestion. Personally, I tend to stay off Twitter as much as possible. I think Siyi also mentioned this, but it can be quite a kind of toxic environment. It's useful to kind of see what one is up against. But I personally find Instagram to be a slightly kind of healthier environment than Twitter, also just under the kind of current situation of Twitter and X and everything that's going on there. But yeah, and there are also lots of exciting media organizations that are looking into things like these, and as I think Kiran mentioned, UN bodies, OECD, things like that are often posting things. In terms of things related to LGBTQ gender topics, I find that ILGA is a brilliant organization that posts a lot of really diverse information and also data. So I highly recommend looking at them, and they do also cover women's issues too. So yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Excellent tips. Kiran or Siyi, do you have any tips for people looking to follow the conversations online?
Yeah, so there's a lot of discussion happening on Twitter here, but I wouldn't suggest that, they should look at what Twitter only is saying, because sometimes there is fake information also being circulated and it spreads like wildfire. So unless I'm really sure about which account to follow, I would suggest people to go to that particular account. I myself prefer to keep away from, unhealthy discourse. So I would like to jump to that, but yeah, there is a lot of movement going on when it comes to Twitter in India, and not that much on Instagram for that matter. Siyi may be able to tell more about she can tell more about her experience and which social media platform to follow.
Right. The social media platforms that I have found to be very informative in these stories I've done, they're mostly in Chinese and on Chinese social media. So if you do read in Chinese, I'm trying to remember them on the top of my head. There's one account called 女孩怕. It's Girls Don't Be Afraid. And then they're very up to date and on women's issues. Every time there's a major event that happened, they would have some kind of commentary. And there is also a law firm called Qian Qian in Beijing. And they also have some social media accounts that so I think they're very focused on women's rights and women's protection. So they are very up to beat in those topics as well. For sex education, I interviewed 2 organizations that also have strong presence on social media. One is called Made Love, and the other one is called Evolving Eye. And I think in Chinese it's 遇见爱. Yes, those are the ones I just remember on the top of my head. And if whoever asked this question needs, I'm also happy to put together a list of links and everything, of course. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll stop there. I'll actually ask one last question because I'm an educator, so I always have to ask this question. Does anybody have one piece of advice for a young journalist who's interested in getting into covering women's issues in the region? Something you could pass on.
I think if I can start, and I feel like today's session has really been an example of this. I think finding a community, whether it's within your own organization or of other journalists in your region, just of women and like-minded people who are looking into these issues. It's so important to have a space to discuss these things safely, even if the ideas don't actually end up becoming stories. Just being able to have someone to bounce off of. Obviously, it's sometimes a lot easier said than done, particularly in places like, for example, Afghanistan, or I can imagine to an extent China, and places where things are more heavily controlled. But yeah, I think just not being afraid to go to events or join online chat forums and things, and just kind of make connections with fellow women. For me, I've found that to be really valuable. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, so what I want to say is that there is no dearth of issues in this space, so you have this vast area to cover. And if you are really passionate about covering women's issues, and not only gender related issues and just in the reproductive field, but also when it comes to business, whether they are participating in the startup ecosystem or not, or how they are breaking the glass ceiling by becoming pilots or commercial pilots or fighter pilots, which is part of one of the stories, another stories I worked on. So there is lot many opportunities in this field. So don't be afraid to touch this. And if you have really something in your heart or in your mind that you want to cover it, you do talk to your editors. And if your idea is turned down first time, maybe next time, another time, it is taken up, and please keep pressing. And if you really come up with some good research, some good initial points, the idea can definitely be taken forward by your editors. That's what I have seen in my reporting career. And I have reported on many issues, despite not being a specialist in this field. I have taken up the issues related to women, and my editors have really encouraged me to write about them. So I'm sure if the topic is good, it will be taken up, and please keep trying. That's what my piece of advice.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Siyi?
And I think this is kind of continuing with what Kiran just said. There are so many issues within this field, and even outside what looks like to be outside of this field, there's always a gender lens to, I wouldn't say always, but oftentimes there's a gender lens to every story. So if you care about kind of shining more spotlight on gender-related issues, maybe just to try to find that angle in different stories. I would also say that it's important for us to remember to think about whose voices to include in any story. And I think, well, here we're all, like on this panel, we're all women, but we all have our own point of privilege, or the other way around. Then I think in every story, what I found very useful is to challenge my own assumptions of every issue, my understanding of every issue that I report on. And lastly, this would be for all the young women reporters out there who, like me, believe they have not reported enough on any issue. It's okay to have imposter syndrome, but I think when we have an eye for a story, it's important that we try to carry it out in the best way that we can, despite the limits that we believe we might have, but maybe we don't have.
Absolutely. That's all very valuable advice. Thank you so much. Thank you, Christine and SOPA, for bringing us together. This has been a really valuable, interesting discussion. I think it could go on for hours, probably. We just continue to learn things. And thank you so much, Alice, Kiran, and Siyi, for taking your time, sharing your experience. Definitely, I'm looking forward to seeing what you all do next. And also congratulations on your recently won SOPA. It's a big achievement. And so, yeah, get rid of that imposter syndrome. You've already proven that you're not an imposter. I know the feeling. So thank you so much. And hopefully see you all very soon. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right. Hello, everybody.